Tabitha hurried through the winding streets of Jerusalem, clutching a sealed letter against her chest as the moon hovered low and pale above the rooftops. Each step echoed in the sleeping city, while torches flickered in distant doorways, casting dancing shadows across the stone alleys. She was no stranger to late-night errands on behalf of her master, an important figure in the high priest's court, but tonight, an unspoken tension seemed to weigh on the air. Rumors circled about a teacher from Nazareth who performed miracles and spoke of a coming kingdom, stirring hope and suspicion alike. Although she was merely a messenger, she could sense the growing unease in the city's corridors of power. It was as though everyone anticipated an upheaval that might erupt at any moment. Tabitha paused before an imposing wooden door near the temple's outer walls, heart pounding as she recalled her instructions. Deliver the sealed letter, wait for no reply, and return immediately. She drew a shaky breath, steeling herself to knock. The door opened soundlessly, revealing a hooded figure who snatched the envelope from her hands without a word. In the faint lantern glow, she glimpsed the stern line of his jaw before the door slammed shut. She stood for a moment, uncertain, then turned to leave, feeling the weight of the night pressing in on her. Only a few steps away, she heard voices, a trio of muffled whispers carried on the still air. Curiosity tugged at her. Normally she would have hurried home, but something about the urgent, hushed tones stopped her in her tracks. Carefully, she slipped into the shadow of a narrow passage, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She inched closer, straining to make out words. The conversation was tense, peppered with talk of betrayal and a plan to entrap someone influential. Though she could not see the speakers, she caught a name: Judas. The men spoke of silver, of a dangerous alliance, and of a night soon to come when everything would change. Tabitha felt a chill creep through her, realizing she was witnessing the seeds of a plot that could shake Jerusalem's foundations. When a gust of wind rattled a hanging lantern, she feared she might be discovered, so she crouched low, praying to remain hidden. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. The conspirators finished their urgent meeting, footsteps receding into the deeper shadows. Slowly, Tabitha emerged, uneasy thoughts swirling. She glanced around, half expecting someone to leap from the darkness. No one did. Still, the city felt altered, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She whispered a silent prayer for courage and set off for her master's residence. On the way, her imagination conjured ominous scenarios. Why would Judas, one of the teacher's own followers, if rumors were true, conspire with officials? Could it be the high priest's plan? Or something even wider in scope? She knew better than to speak out of turn, yet her conscience pricked her. If what she'd heard was true, an innocent man might be in danger. By the time she reached the courtyard of her master's home, Tabitha felt torn between duty and the stirring of concern for a man she had never met. The flicker of a torch illuminated her face, revealing the conflict etched in her eyes. She would never forget the voices in the dark, or the icy certainty that a betrayal was on the horizon. All she could do was deliver messages and carry secrets. But now she feared she had stumbled into something that could cost her life. Exhausted and uneasy, she retired to her modest quarters, aware that sleep would not come easily. Outside, the moon sank lower, and Jerusalem lay silent in the hush before dawn, as though holding its breath for the tempest that would soon break. Yet even in her apprehension, a spark of curiosity burned within her. She wondered if the teacher from Nazareth was truly as compassionate as people claimed, if his miracles were genuine, and if his words carried the divine authority that so many whispered about. Perhaps, in some corner of her heart, She hoped that by learning more, she could satisfy the need to do what was right. That night, as she finally closed her eyes, Tabitha's dreams were haunted by the echo of that single name, Judas, and the stark finality in the men's voices as they spoke of impending doom. She awoke before sunrise, the faint glow of dawn illuminating the edges of the sky. Already, the streets would soon surge with pilgrims arriving for the Passover feast. If the rumors were true, and tensions were running high, Tabitha suspected that this year's festival might prove more eventful than any in recent memory. With a sigh, she rose to prepare for another day of errands, her mind returning to the chilling conversation in the alley. Little did she know that her small act of eavesdropping would thrust her deeper into the currents of history than she could ever have imagined. In a world where power and faith constantly clashed, her own quiet resolve might make all the difference. And so, with the sun just peeking over the rooftops, she stepped into her role once more as the messenger, clutching new scrolls and letters dictated by superiors who spoke in cryptic terms about meeting in private rooms. She shivered at the memory of the hooded figure who had accepted the letter the previous night. Somewhere in the labyrinth of corridors and cloistered plans, a terrible scheme was taking shape, and she, in spite of her youth and lowly position, might be the only one aware of the disaster unfolding. Though fear weighed heavily on her heart, an even stronger sense of purpose began to stir, urging her to stay vigilant, to listen closely, and to watch for any sign of betrayal that might expose the truth before it was too late. The early light of dawn revealed a Jerusalem in the midst of preparation for the great feast. Tabitha stood in the bustling courtyard of the high priest's residence, where servants rushed about with packages of spices, linens, and sacrificial offerings. Despite the morning clamour, her mind drifted back to the urgent whispers she had overheard the night before. Her heart lurched whenever she recalled the name Judas and the shadowy threat it seemed to carry. She should have buried this knowledge deep and pretended ignorance, but she found she could not. An unspoken sense of responsibility pressed upon her, compelling her to act. Yet she feared every step might be watched. While delivering fresh scrolls to her master's study, she dared not look him in the eye. She had no proof of his involvement in the conspiracy, only a gnawing suspicion that those in power were moving pieces on a secret chessboard. Without warning, a stern-faced steward approached her, demanding she run another errand. As he thrust a small parchment into her hand, Tabitha noticed the high priest's seal. The steward muttered an instruction to deliver it to a house near the temple gates and to be swift about it. Her pulse quickened. Could this be related to the plot she had stumbled upon? She murmured a quiet prayer for courage, stepped outside, and wove through the throngs of pilgrims. She could not ignore the strange tension in the air. Vendors called out to passers-by, but a nervous edge tinged their voices. Roman soldiers patrolled more visibly than usual, their polished armour glinting in the sun. Tabitha kept her gaze low, mindful not to attract their attention. At last, she found the house that bore the symbol of a small carved olive branch on its door. She took a steadying breath and knocked. An elderly woman answered, expression guarded. Tabitha offered the sealed note, but before she could leave, the woman slipped a tiny scrap of parchment into her palm. "Take care, child," the woman whispered, then shut the door gently. Tabitha stood there, baffled, until she stepped away from the threshold and dared to look at the scrap in her hand. 3 short words were scrawled. "Watch the grove." Her thoughts whirled. A chill coursed through her. Only the night before, she had overheard something about meeting in an olive grove. Could this be the same place? She had little time to dwell on it. Her duties pressed her onward, but she clutched that message as though it were her only lifeline. Arriving back at the residence, she hurried to her small chamber, hoping for a moment of solitude. She unrolled the scrap and read the words again and again, heart pounding. The Garden of Gethsemane was known for its ancient olive trees. Could that be the grove in question? And if so, who had slipped her this warning? Just then, footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. She stuffed the paper into her satchel as a fellow servant entered, noticing her flustered expression. With genuine concern, he asked if she was unwell. Tempted to confide in him, Tabitha faltered. Her instincts urged her to keep silent. Too many ears might be loyal to the high priest's circle. After sending the servant on his way with a forced smile, she exhaled slowly, feeling as though a net were tightening around her. She had to learn more about the man called Judas and the plot unfolding in secret. Yet she also knew she walked a perilous path. Defying the high priest's authority could be deadly. Gazing out the window at the sun climbing higher, she resolved to seek answers under the cloak of darkness. If the note's cryptic directive was true, then the Garden of Gethsemane would be where the next steps in this conspiracy played out. She prayed she would find the courage to discover the truth before it was too late. In her heart, she sensed that every moment mattered. Night spread its dark veil over Jerusalem, softening the bustle of daytime into a hush broken only by distant murmurs and the occasional clang of a guard's armor. Tabitha slipped quietly from the high priest's residence, her sandals scarcely making a sound on the stone paths. A single lantern, shielded by her cloak, cast a small circle of light to guide her way as she made for the Garden of Gethsemane. She remembered the cryptic note warning her to watch the grove, and she dreaded what she might find. The streets closer to the city's heart were alive with latecomers seeking lodging for the Passover, but the crowds thinned as she approached the slope of the Mount of Olives. The garden lay in a pocket of darkness, ancient trees stretching gnarled limbs toward the sky. Holding her breath, Tabitha extinguished her lantern. She slipped among the trunks, heart hammering. Somewhere ahead, low voices drifted on the breeze. She inched closer, peering through the silvery moonlight. A small gathering of men, their faces shrouded, conversed in tense whispers. She could make out the glint of armor on two of them, temple guards perhaps, and between them stood a figure whose voice shook with mingled resolve and shame. A flicker of recognition struck her. This could only be Judas. She had never seen his face before, but the intensity of his posture and the urgent exchange of coins confirmed her suspicions. The men's words were hushed, yet she caught fragments of what they said. An arrangement to seize someone during the night, away from the crowds, to avoid a riot. 30 pieces of silver glinted in the guard's hand, passed to Judas, who clenched the bag as though it weighed more than mere metal. Tabitha trembled behind a broad olive tree. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, yet she stayed. Something compelled her to bear witness to this moment, to remember every detail. The hidden moonlight, the trembling leaves, and the look of torment on Judas's face. He insisted he knew exactly where the teacher would be at night, and that he would give a signal, a kiss of greeting. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to Tabitha, and she found her breath catching in her throat. Suddenly, a twig snapped under her foot. One of the guards stiffened. Their heads whipped in her direction. Panic surged through her, and she flattened herself against the tree, heart pounding so loudly she thought they must hear it. She stifled the urge to bolt, praying she was deep enough in the shadows. For a tense moment, no one spoke. Then another guard said something about a stray cat, and their collective suspicion seemed to ease. Moments later, Judas and the guards departed, their figures melting into the darkness like conspirators vanishing from a nightmare. Only when she was sure they had gone did Tabitha allow herself to breathe again. Her legs trembled as she emerged from her hiding place. She felt dazed, consumed by the enormity of what she had just witnessed. This was no mere political maneuver. It was a betrayal set to change the course of countless lives. Her thoughts raced. If she did nothing, an innocent man might soon be taken. But what could she do? Who would believe the testimony of a lowly servant girl? If she went to the high priest himself, she would surely be punished, for clearly his own men were involved. Shaken, she made her way slowly back toward the city. She yearned for the safety of her quarters, but knew that rest would elude her tonight. Each step felt heavier than the last. The secret she carried pressed on her mind and heart, and she wondered if by trying to expose it, she might condemn herself. As the city walls rose before her, illuminated by sparse torches, Tabitha clutched her cloak tight. Somehow she knew there was no turning back. She had walked into the olive grove an uncertain witness, and now she returned, knowing that a destiny far larger than herself was unfolding. When dawn broke, its pale light found Tabitha pacing the small confines of her chamber. She had slept only in fitful snatches, the memory of Judas's pained expression haunting her every time she closed her eyes. A swirl of questions invaded her thoughts. Should she warn the teacher's followers, if she could find them? Would they even believe her, or accuse her of being part of the plot? The risk of speaking out was enormous. The high priest's authority was nearly absolute, and any suggestion that his circle condoned or orchestrated a betrayal would be met with force. Yet each moment spent in silence only brought the betrayers closer to their goal. Summoned to the courtyard, Tabitha received another errand, a message for one of the high priest's senior aides. She took the small scroll and ventured into the bustling streets. Vendors hawked wares, donkeys brayed, and pilgrims jostled one another in their haste to prepare for Passover. The mundane rush of life mocked the turmoil within her. Even so, she forced her way through the crowd, reaching a narrow corridor leading to an official's residence. There, she delivered the scroll to a stone-faced man who barely acknowledged her. As she turned to leave, he asked her to wait, flicking his gaze across her as though measuring her usefulness. Then, without preamble, he told her the high priest's staff was searching for a young woman seen lurking near the temple walls at odd hours. His tone was cold. Tabitha's heart lurched. Could he suspect her involvement already? She kept her expression blank, murmured a respectful confirmation that she would report any suspicious person, and swiftly departed. The man's words still rang in her ears as she navigated the crowded streets. She was in real danger now. Nonetheless, she could not ignore the sense that time was running out. Determined, she made her way to a section of the city where she had heard rumors the teacher's followers might gather. Narrow lanes twisted past humble dwellings. No soldiers patrolled here, and the air smelled of bread baking in small ovens. Her pulse quickened when she noticed a man standing watch near a low doorway, scanning passerby as though expecting trouble. Gathering her courage, Tabitha approached him. She whispered that she had urgent news regarding the teacher, and he eyed her warily. After a tense silence, the door opened from within, revealing a small group of people seated on cushions. Though their faces showed signs of weariness, a resolute energy filled the space. She recognized some from distant glimpses in the temple courts. One, whom others called John, stepped forward with a grave expression. Keeping her voice low, Tabitha recounted her clandestine observation in the olive grove, the exchange of silver, and the unmistakable presence of Judas. Several in the room gasped. Others exchanged troubled glances. John quietly asked how she had stumbled upon such a secret. She admitted she served in the high priest's household and had overheard rumors, which drove her to investigate. The disciples listened, their faces pale, torn between dread and uncertain resolve. Some whispered that Jesus had predicted this betrayal, yet hearing the details turned rumor into harrowing reality. Peter, who had been pacing anxiously, clenched his fists, wrestling with a mix of anger and disbelief. The weight in the room was palpable. Though Tabitha feared retribution from every side, she sensed a measure of relief among them. Now they had confirmation, albeit terrifying, of what was truly happening. Even so, an air of confusion prevailed. Should they flee? Should they confront Judas directly? Or simply trust in Jesus' guidance, which so often defied human expectation? With her confession done, Tabitha prepared to leave, but John gently urged her to be careful, promising that her courage would not be forgotten. She nodded, and for the first time since stepping into the dark corridor the previous night, she felt a glimmer of hope. Yet danger still crouched on every side. As she retreated into the chaotic streets once more, Tabitha realized her life had irrevocably changed, swept into events that threatened to transform not just Jerusalem, but the entire world. Twilight fell again, a somber haze settling over the city. Tabitha stood near the outskirts of the upper city, her heart hammering in her chest. Despite the disciples' cautions, she had resolved to find them once more before the night was over. Information was her only weapon. If there was any chance to aid the teacher's followers and thwart a grave injustice, she was compelled to try. Yet as she waited in the shadow of a stone archway, watching for the cloaked man who had agreed to guide her, unease coiled in her stomach. She thought of the senior aide's pointed questions, of the high priest's vigilance, and of the swirling rumors that now seemed to envelop every corner of Jerusalem. A sudden rustle of robes made her jump. The cloaked stranger appeared, beckoning wordlessly for her to follow. He led her through a maze of winding alleys until they reached a modest courtyard lit by a single oil lamp. There, huddled in tense conversation, stood John and a few others. Their faces reflected a deep conflict. Fear mingled with unwavering devotion. When they saw Tabitha, a ripple of urgency passed among them. She discovered that the teacher, Jesus, had chosen to remain in the city, observing the Passover meal with his closest companions. Once again, the notion that he might know of his own impending betrayal seized Tabitha's thoughts. Fearful that soldiers or temple guards could pounce at any moment, she pressed them for details about the plan. Whispers revealed they intended to stay with Jesus until he went to pray in a familiar place, presumably the Garden of Gethsemane. Tabitha's stomach tightened. That was precisely where she had seen Judas make his dreadful bargain. The group seemed divided. Some wanted to flee, while others believed they must stand beside Jesus. As they spoke, footsteps approached from the narrow street beyond the courtyard. Everyone froze. For one agonizing second, Tabitha expected to see armed guards. Instead, a young woman bearing a jar of wine arrived breathless, reporting that the city's tension had escalated. She said Roman soldiers were also on alert, as if anticipating unrest, grim faces all around. Their time was short. John turned to Tabitha, a questioning look in his eyes. Should she remain with them or slip away to avoid detection? Still determined, she insisted on accompanying them, if only to serve as a lookout and relay any final warning. Despite her trembling hands, she refused to abandon what she felt was right. So together, under the fading light, they left the courtyard in small groups, each taking different routes to avoid suspicion. Tabitha found herself walking beside a disciple who spoke only in brief bursts. He carried an air of sorrow, convinced they were walking into a trial of faith greater than any they had known. At the crest of a hill, they regrouped. From that vantage, torches could be seen bobbing through the city below, as though patrols fanned out in search of something, or someone. Every flicker made Tabitha's pulse surge, yet none came directly their way. Under cover of darkness, they descended to a hidden path leading to the Garden of Gethsemane. The hush of night fell heavier here, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Tabitha could hardly breathe for the dread coiling in her chest. She wanted to shout warnings to anyone who might listen, to stop this terrible betrayal. But the disciples seemed resigned, some even whispering that Jesus had foreseen these events. So they waited, hearts pounding, for Jesus' arrival and the confrontation that surely lay in wait. In the hush, Tabitha remembered the cryptic scrap of parchment. Watch the grove. Now, standing on the threshold of those ancient olive trees, she understood how close they were to calamity. Though her footsteps felt heavier than ever, she resolved not to turn back. She had taken this path of her own will, guided by conscience. Even if she was powerless to change the outcome, she would stand witness. For in the darkness of Gethsemane, destiny drew near, and the faint flicker of hope within her refused to die. In the dimness beneath the olive trees, Tabitha stood with her back pressed against a broad trunk, breathing shallowly as she surveyed the scene unfolding in moonlit silhouettes. Jesus, the teacher she had heard so much about, knelt a short distance away. His disciples lingered close by, some fighting against weariness, others pacing anxiously. The stillness of the garden magnified every sound, the whisper of a breeze, the shifting of cloaks, the quiet prayers muttered by weary souls. A pang of awe and sorrow welled in Tabitha's heart. She realized that, though she had never exchanged a single word with Jesus, his presence radiated a gentle strength unlike any she had felt before. Then came the flicker of torchlight, dancing at the edge of the grove. Tabitha stiffened, recalling the voices and the clink of silver she had overheard. The disciples roused, startled by the approaching glow. Out of the shadows emerged Judas, leading a band of temple guards armed with swords and clubs. The air crackled with tension. Tabitha's heart thundered in her ears as Judas stepped forward to greet Jesus with a kiss. The sight of it felt like a knife twisting in her chest. In that fleeting moment, the hush of betrayal hung in the air like a held breath. The guards surged in to seize Jesus, and a brief struggle erupted. One disciple drew a sword, cutting off a servant's ear, only for Jesus to calmly rebuke the violence. He reached out, and in an astonishing gesture of mercy, healed the wounded servant. Tabitha's breath caught at the sight, her mind reeling with the collision of cruelty and compassion playing out before her. Despite the confusion, Jesus allowed himself to be bound. Horror mingled with awe as Tabitha watched him taken without resistance. Every instinct in her screamed for her to rush forward, to do something. Yet she knew that any intervention would be crushed immediately. Tears pricked her eyes. Judas, now watching from the sidelines, wore an expression of mingled anguish and terror. No one paid heed to the lone servant girl trembling in the shadows. The guards dragged Jesus away, torches flaring as they wound up the path toward the city. Some disciples fled, voices tight with grief and panic. Others followed at a distance, uncertain and afraid. Tabitha felt paralyzed, torn between chasing after the guards and preserving her own life. In that instant, she understood that no last-minute warning or desperate plea could halt the course now set in motion. Finally, she found the courage to move. She rushed after the retreating figures, staying far enough behind to remain unseen. They traversed the slope of the Mount of Olives, Jerusalem's walls looming ahead like a silent witness. Though she longed to call out, she forced herself to stay quiet, tears slipping down her cheeks. Her heart pounded with a frantic beat, knowing this teacher, who had shown mercy even at the moment of his capture, was being led toward judgment and likely death. By the time the grim procession reached the city gates, Tabitha could go no further without risking discovery. She halted in a dark alcove, watching as they passed beneath the torchlit archway. The clang of the gates echoed in her mind long after they disappeared from sight. Slowly, she leaned against the wall, struggling to steady her racing pulse. She felt small and powerless, yet a stubborn flicker of resolve sparked within her. She did not know how events would unfold, but she would not bury what she had witnessed. If speaking the truth cost her everything, so be it. She would rather stand on the side of honesty and justice than cower in fear. Wiping her tears, she turned away from the city gates. The night sky stretched overhead, stars flickering like distant beacons. Though darkness seemed to reign, Tabitha carried within her a seed of hope that perhaps this was not the end. She remembered the gentleness in Jesus' eyes and the unwavering faith of his followers. Somehow she believed that goodness would not be extinguished by betrayal or violence. With slow steps, she made her way back toward the olive grove, her thoughts brimming with solemn determination. Whether her role had been small or great, she had witnessed the truth, and that truth would shape her life from this night forward.